right, we are starting a new chapter on changing allele frequencies. And just a reminder, last chapter was on trying to keep allele frequencies constant. In other words, in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. That means that all those 5 factors we talked about, if they were present, it means that they would change the allele frequency. If they weren't, then it would be in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. So what we're going to focus on in this chapter is those five factors that change allele frequencies, and we're going to talk about them in a little bit more detail. So the first two we're going to talk about in this section of notes is the non-random mating and migration, and how they change allele frequencies. As a reminder, Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium is unchanging allele frequencies from generation to generation. And there are 5 conditions that can change allele frequencies: non-random mating, migration, genetic drift, mutation, and natural selection. And we're going to start out by focusing on these first 2. What happens is that they change the allele frequencies and ultimately the phenotypic frequencies, and that over time can lead to evolution. So the first one, non-random mating, remember that means that individuals of a certain genotype tend to reproduce more often with each other. There's been many studies done over the years, and what they found is that people tend to marry people similar to themselves about 80% of the time. And we've talked about this before in the last chapter, but some of the things that might attract another person to choosing their potential mate is things like physical appearance. It could be ethnic or religious preferences, maybe just intelligence or other shared interests. But most of the time we're going to pick somebody who maybe has similar values, and maybe we're brought up very similarly. Certainly opposites attract, but a lot of times we're attracted to people very similar to ourselves. And so if we were to look at this a little diagram here, if we started out with a population that had kind of an equal representation of those shapes, but then if all of a sudden this particular shape started mating more often, and they tended to choose other individuals to mate with that were similar to them, over time they would be passing on their traits, their alleles, and that would become more common in the population. Where have we seen examples of this? Well, when we have males that father many children, then they're passing on their alleles to their offspring. In the Hopi Indians found in southwestern United States, albinism is a lot more common than in the U.S. population. Well, why is that? Well, the men who have albinism, who are albino, did not go out with the hunt with the other Native Americans, because they would be out in the sun too much and their skin couldn't handle it. So where were they instead? They were back in the tents with the women, helping them with their work that they needed to do there. Well, I think a little bit more happened back in those tents with the men who stayed back, and that they then passed on the allele for albinism, and that just over time became more common in that population of individuals. Genghis Khan, in his trying to take over that region of the country in Asia, he now has about 16 million men living today that have his Y chromosome because of having sex with so many women in the raping and pillaging of the different areas that they overtook. He then passed on his genes, his genetics, to all of those individuals. Also, you can just kind of control reproduction by trying to avoid passing on a genetic disorder by controlling either your mate choice or your reproduction. And so Ashkenazi Jews because of their religion, a lot of them would tend to marry within their same religious background. But because of that, again, that kind of concentrates the gene pool, and they tend to have certain genetic disorders that are a lot higher in frequency with their population than in the general population. And one of those is Tay-Sachs disease. Very, very sad disease because the children are born seemingly to appear healthy, but then by 2 years of age, they just start deteriorating and eventually die while they're still quite young. And so it's just very, very sad. And so certain couples may elect not to have children just to avoid passing on this disorder. It's an autosomal recessive disorder. So if you had two individuals who are carriers, well, they would already have a 25% chance of passing that disease on to their child. And nobody wants to see their child die, and especially from a horrible death. So they can purposely choose to either reproduce or not, and therefore that it's non-random. They're selecting to do that to avoid passing on that disease. We've talked about consanguinity before. That's marriage between blood relatives. When we would do the pedigrees, and there'd be that double line in between. Yeah, that usually indicated that they were closely related. We said a lot of times in the royal family they would do that, and so the reason that's we ban that, we have laws against marrying or having kids with people you're closely related to, is you have very similar genes, very similar alleles, and so it increases the proportion of homozygotes in a population if you were to have children with somebody you're closely related to. Thus, you could increase the risk of passing on serious genetic disorders because of that. Endogamy is marriage within a community. Well, yeah, a lot of people are childhood sweethearts. They might marry their high school sweetheart that they grew up with in the same town. Nothing wrong with that. But sometimes if different families came from a certain, if their ancestors came from a certain region and then they all settled in an area, a certain town, again, you might be distantly related to somebody without even really realizing it, based on, your ancestors that settled in that area. And so, again, it's not like you'd share as many alleles, but you still might have a higher likelihood of having some alleles that are similar, even if you were distantly related, and therefore you could increase the risk of passing on certain genetic disorders as well. Migration, again, that's movement of individuals from one population to another, okay? So you're moving your genes from one area to another. Sometimes it's known as gene flow. Well, what you're doing then is you're adding or removing alleles, and then that can alter the genotypic frequencies in those populations. And we can map that across geographical areas, language areas as well. Again, let's say that these two individuals migrated, you would see over time then, if they brought their alleles with them, that this would increase in that population then. Those alleles would increase in the population. Related to migration is the idea of a cline. A cline is a phenomenon where the allele frequencies change from one neighboring population to another. So as immigrants introduce their alleles and emigrants remove them, that's going to change the allele frequencies from one population to another. An example of this is galactokinase deficiency. It's an autosomal recessive disease that causes blindness. It's common in the Vlax Roma gypsies who live in Bulgaria, but the trait gets less common as you move west geographically. So again, as the neighboring populations, it can change. Here's where it's a little bit more concentrated, individuals who have that disorder. As we move out into greater Bulgaria, it gets to be a little bit less. And as we keep moving westward, it gets less and less. Okay? Less and less common. And so a cline, again, is just that change in the allele frequencies from one neighboring population to another. Think of it in terms of, like, when you think of your ancestors who maybe have moved here. Think, whether you're of a lot of Scandinavians, kind of settled in the Midwest area here. Like, even I'm thinking in North Dakota, where I grew up down in Gwinner, a lot of people of Swedish background, Norwegian background, some German background. But as you keep heading west towards Edgeley, Wishick, kind of that area, then there tends to be more German-Russian background. And so just as you just keep kind of moving from one area to another, you can even see where different individuals settled who came from different countries and brought with them their alleles, their traits and characteristics. So different things, those Kleins can be correlated to include things like historical events, cultural differences, just geographical barriers, maybe rivers that separate two regions, mountains, things like that. Language differences can divide different populations. If you can't really speak the language of the next neighboring population, you're probably not going to settle there. And so you can start to see differences among populations there. Patterns of migration, all of these things can influence those Klein boundaries. So non-random mating and migration are two factors that can change allele frequencies.